Churchill. In the rolling hills of the Sudan in North Africa, 400 members of the British cavalry lined up and prepared to do battle with 600 Egyptian dervish soldiers. The odds were against them this sun-scorched day in 1898, but the cavalry was confident and fearless. They were members of the 21st Lancers, a superbly trained and experienced regiment that included some of England's best fighting men. The dervishes were known for their fierceness, but the British were known for their bravery. As they galloped forward at top speed to meet the enemy, in the front line was a 24-year-old officer named Winston Churchill. He had his eye on glory that day. For years now he'd been looking for an opportunity to prove to himself and to the world that he was a man with a destiny. "I have faith in my star," he had said. "That is that I am intended to do something in the world." Just as the Lancers were about halfway to the Egyptian forces, suddenly 3,000 dervishes leaped out of a dry riverbed in front of them. The Lancers were outnumbered 9-1. Never hesitating, the British cavalry crashed into the enemy formation in what would be the British Army's last great cavalry charge. After 2 minutes of shooting, slashing, and chilling screams, the cavalry formed and held a defensive position. But 48 Lancers had been killed and hundreds of others wounded. Churchill, still in front, was unscathed. The Battle of Omdurman was Winston Churchill's first experience with fame. When he returned home, he wrote about the gallant episode in a book entitled The River War. The book gained him even wider fame and popularity, and also more enemies. British officers didn't like the way he criticized his superiors in the war, and felt he was trying to make himself look like a hero. Some of his fellow soldiers also complained that he exaggerated his part to gain attention. By the time he emerged from the war in Sudan, Churchill had decided the army was too restricting, and that he was meant for bigger and better things. He resolved to run for the British Parliament. It was the start of a long political career that would, in many ways, duplicate the patterns of what had happened at the Battle of Omdurman. There would be many brave assaults on opponents and obstacles. There would be many who saw him as a hero, and there would be many who criticized his arrogance and glory-seeking. Winston Churchill was to become one of the most powerful and controversial figures of modern history. By the time he'd finished his long life, he had held most of the high offices of state in Great Britain. He was a member of Parliament for 60 years, served twice as Prime Minister, and most importantly, he led his country through the difficult years of World War II, serving as the embodiment of British courage and idealism. He was, just as he had said, a man intended to do something for the world. Churchill began his life with all the privileges and opportunities an ambitious man could dream of. He was born November 30th, 1874, in an enormous and grand palace called Blenheim in Oxfordshire, England. Already the Churchills were one of the foremost aristocratic families of Britain. Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a member of Parliament and the son of the Duke of Marlborough, who was Viceroy to Ireland. His mother, Jenny Churchill, was the daughter of a wealthy New York stockbroker, a member of high society, who spent her teenage years at the court of Napoleon III in Paris. His parents had met at a ball for the Prince of Wales. During the 1940s, when Winston was addressing the United States Congress, he said, "If my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own." As a young Churchill, there was almost nothing Winston lacked for. He had rooms full of toys, of which the model soldiers were his favorite, the best schools, fine clothes and carriages, estates to explore, and trips to Europe. All he didn't have was parental affection. Jenny Churchill was only 20 when Winston was born, and she was much more interested in her lively social life than in raising a child. He said later that throughout his whole childhood, he only saw his mother as she was coming and going to parties, all dressed up in beautiful gowns and jewels. More painful to him was the indifference of his father. Randolph Churchill was consumed with his work and seldom paid any attention to his son, except to criticize him. For years, Winston struggled to earn his father's respect and caring. He wrote letters from his boarding school, pleading with his father to write to him, which he never did. He begged his father to visit, which he also never did. The only source of love Winston had in his youth was his devoted Nanny. It was she who saw him take his first steps and speak his first words, and she who wrote to him at school. His parents remained distant figures that he admired from afar. The situation was made even worse by the fact that Winston's father was suffering from syphilis, and as the disease advanced, he became forgetful, sometimes incoherent and prone to bizarre behavior and outbursts. Winston knew nothing of his father's illness. It was kept secret from him until Randolph Churchill was on his deathbed. Meanwhile, Jenny took refuge in her lovers, and Winston took refuge in his dreams of grandeur. When Winston was 7, he was sent off to school, the first in a series of educational disasters. One teacher called him a regular pickle. Another said he has no ambition, and a third reported he is constant trouble to everyone and is always in some scrape or other. He was a failure both academically and socially. His parents responded by sending him off to another school, where the teachers at least saw promise, if not performance. Then they arranged to get him into the prestigious public school Harrow, even though on his entrance exam he'd written only his name and the number 1. He was placed in the lowest division of the lowest grade, and it took him 3 years to earn a promotion. Teachers complained of his slovenliness, his tardiness, his tendency to lose his books and papers, and, of course, his low grades. He did, however, have a flair for writing and speaking. One of his few achievements in school was an award for reciting a 1,200-line poem without error, and he also wrote for the school paper. Finally, his parents decided the only hope for him was military school. Certainly he'd never get into university. So they shipped him off to the military college, Sandhurst, to train as an Army officer. Winston was ecstatic that finally he was on a course that held some challenge and excitement. Of the years of formal schooling and examinations that were now behind him, he said, "I would rather have apprenticed as a bricklayer's mate or run errands as a messenger boy or help my father dress the front windows of a grocer's shop. It would have been real. It would have been natural. It would have taught me more, and I should have done it much better. Also, I should have got to know my father, which would have been a joy to me." Although he grieved over the lack of intimacy with his father, Churchill also admitted that because of it, he had been forced early on to develop independence. "Solitary trees grow strong," he said. At Sandhurst, Churchill determined to reform himself and prove his worth. His school subjects now were far more to his liking: fortifications, tactics, topography, military law, and military administration. He studied so hard that he soon ranked 20th out of 130 students. But just when he was celebrating his first real achievement in life, Winston was called home to bid farewell to his dying father. It was said that years later, when he'd reached the pinnacle of his success, Churchill would often mutter to himself, "Why could he not see what I have done?" By the time he finished at Sandhurst, Winston had developed all the skills and qualities he needed to be a good soldier. The only problem was that England wasn't at war. Anxious to see some action, he took leave from his regiment when he was 21 to join Spanish forces fighting in Cuba. While there, he also served as a war correspondent, and his reports gained him some renown as both a soldier and a writer. When he returned from Cuba, Churchill was disappointed to find he was being sent with his regiment to India. It was quiet in India those days, and he felt there'd be no opportunity to make a reputation for himself. A reputation he'd badly need if he was to get into Parliament, as his father had done. But to India he went, and to fill his time, he read stacks of history, philosophy, and religion books, and most importantly, the annual register of parliamentary debates, which he used to sharpen his opinion and gain an understanding of politics. He also continued to write, sending columns to both British and Indian newspapers. After his stay in India, Churchill joined the 21st Lancers, who fought the dervishes in the Sudan, proving his daring in battle and gaining fame at home. He frankly admitted that he was seeking fame as an entry into politics. He also wrote to his mother, when she expressed fear over his reckless deeds on the battlefield, that "bullets are not worth considering. I am so conceited I do not believe the gods would create so potent a being as myself for so prosaic an ending." In an attempt to make sure his life didn't descend into the prosaic, Churchill returned home and immediately ran for Parliament as a member of the Conservative Party. He lost, but he took the defeat cheerfully. He had made a good showing, and now his name was more widely known. Since he couldn't find himself a seat in Parliament, he then did the next best thing. He found another war to join. When he was 25, Churchill set out for the southern tip of Africa, where the British were fighting the Boers, Dutch farmers who were rebelling against English imperialism in Africa. Churchill went to Africa as a war correspondent for a British newspaper, an adventure that would finally bring him the fame and victory he'd so longed for. In November of 1899, Churchill was on a British train carrying many wounded soldiers when the Boers decided to ambush. The train was prevented from escaping by some damaged cars in the rear. Under heavy fire from Boer rifles, Churchill jumped off the train and unhitched the damaged cars. He climbed back on the train as it started to roll away, but then he noticed there were still some officers down on the tracks firing at the Boers. He leapt off the train again to help defend the officers. The trainload of wounded men chugged away, leaving Churchill and the other officers behind. They were captured and held as prisoners of war. This escapade in itself would have been enough to make Churchill a hero, but then, after a month in prison, he managed a daring escape. For days he struggled through the African wilderness, a large vulture following close behind. The reward poster distributed by the Boers offered £25 for his return and described him as 25 years old, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, walks with a slight stoop, pale appearance, red-brown hair, almost invisible little mustache, speaks through his nose, cannot pronounce the letter S, cannot speak Dutch, last seen in a brown suit. Just at the point of collapse, he staggered into a house, which turned out to be the home of the only English sympathizer in the entire area. The man helped smuggle Churchill onto a train and over the border into safe territory. By the time he made it back home from Africa, Churchill was a national hero, much to the despair of his fellow soldiers who felt he calculated his heroic deeds for fame. Even less happy were the British officers who'd been taken prisoner with Churchill and whom he left behind when he escaped. But the British public loved the story. He wrote about his adventures in glowing detail and went on an international lecture tour that earned him thousands of dollars. When he spoke at Carnegie Hall in New York, it was Mark Twain who introduced him, saying, "Mr. Churchill, by his father, is an Englishman, but by his mother's an American. No doubt a blend that makes the perfect man." Finally, it seemed as if the voters agreed. He was elected to Parliament the following year at the age of 26, and 4 years later switched from the Conservative to the Liberal Party because he disagreed with the former's view on taxes. His attendance was almost perfect. He rarely missed a debate, and he delivered 9 major speeches in his first year alone. By the time he was 34, he was president of the Board of Trade, making him the youngest cabinet member in over 50 years. He proposed legislation that limited working hours, abolished sweatshops, guaranteed minimum wages, and a tea break for workers, and provided unemployment insurance. So pleased was he with his accomplishments that he once leaned over to a dinner partner and exclaimed, "We are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." The same year Churchill joined the cabinet, he made another conquest, this time in his personal life. He met a young woman at a dinner party named Clementine Hoser, a beautiful Englishwoman known for the many hearts and engagements she'd broken. The two talked all night long, mostly about Winston, and he then spent several months pursuing her, chiefly with letters. Finally, one night he asked her to marry him. Clementine responded by sending him a simple note that said only the word Winston, with a heart drawn around it. Churchill often said that winning Clementine was his greatest achievement. In fact, he ended his autobiography with the statement, "I married and lived happily ever after." It would seem to be true. They were married 60 years and had 4 children, the first of whom, Diana, caused Churchill to boast, "She is the prettiest child ever seen. She is exactly like me." The marriage made news all over Britain, as did everything else Churchill did. Somehow he always found a way to get his name in the headlines. In 1908, it was the confrontation that came to be known as the Siege of Sydney Street. When a gang of left-wing terrorists murdered a policeman, Churchill took personal charge of the assault on their hideout. He called in troops and a field gun, with which the gang was easily defeated. Again, there were complaints from his opponents that he'd over-dramatized the whole event just to gain more fame. If that was his intention, it worked. By the time he was 36, He was Home Secretary. Churchill's opponents at home were a minor concern compared to the opponents that were gearing up overseas. As Germany began to assert itself in various areas of Europe, Churchill began to see the Kaiser as a serious threat to peace. He was among the first to warn Britain of that threat, and so urgent were his pleas that in 1911 he was made Lord of the Admiralty with the entire British Navy at his command. He began to prepare for war. He drew up plans for a larger, more efficient fleet. Every morning he charted the movements of the German fleet on a large map in his office. He demanded more funds for ships and arms. He also created the Royal Naval Air Service and urged the development of anti-aircraft guns. There was resistance to all of his plans, particularly from Parliament, which grew uneasy with the rising expenses. Many people chose to believe that a war between the two most civilized countries in Europe was impossible, but they began to change their mind in June of 1914 when Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated and war looked inevitable. Churchill promptly mobilized the Navy, which later ensured the fleet was ready for battle as soon as war began. He then took his family on a vacation to await his orders, saying to his wife, "I am interested, geared up, and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that?" A few days later, Germany invaded Belgium, which was protected under a treaty between Germany and Britain. Britain was at war. During the next 5 years, the British Navy fought on almost every ocean in the world. At first, Churchill directed the Navy with skill, although he suffered deep frustration at having to be an administrator when he wanted to be out on the field of action. At one point, he even offered to resign his position as head of the Admiralty so he could command British troops in Belgium. The offer was refused. Churchill's love of battle was so strong that he shocked a group of dinner guests one night by announcing, "Everything we are doing and saying is thrilling. It will be read by 1,000 generations. Think of that. I would not be out of this glorious, delicious war for anything the world could give me." Already there were thousands of dead soldiers lying beneath the soil of France and Belgium, and Churchill was describing the war as glorious and delicious. Things looked a lot less glorious to Churchill in 1915, when he proposed a naval attack on the Dardanelles, a narrow strait between the Aegean and Marmara Seas. The idea was to defeat Turkey from this spot and set up a base of operations for an eastern attack on Germany. His plan was to send in the fleet and back it up with infantry, but basically he was trying to use ships to take land, a plan doomed to disaster. The Dardanelles campaign included one of the biggest tragedies in military history, the storming of the peninsula of Gallipoli. As the British boats landed at Gallipoli and their men stormed the shore, commanders lowered their field glasses so they wouldn't have to watch the slaughter. The men were massacred by the Turks. Dead and dying bodies clogged the shallow waters, and later troops had to climb over their moaning comrades to reach the shore. When it was all over, England had lost 40,000 men, and the blame fell on Winston Churchill. He was lambasted by the press, forced out of the Admiralty, and given a junior post. He was 41 years old, and it seemed as if his brilliant career was over already. Churchill soon resigned from his new obscure post, which he called well-paid inactivity, and discovered a new passion to fill his free time: painting. It started one day when he borrowed his nephew's paint box and began to experiment with brushes and color. Soon he had his own set, which he took with him whenever he traveled. For the rest of his life, painting was Churchill's hobby, his respite, and his solace. Painting, however, could never fill his need for action and grandeur. Within a year after the fiasco at Gallipoli, he joined the army and was given a battalion at the Western Front. He took with him his favorite luxuries: his paints, his cigars, a private stock of liquor, a tin bathtub, a pocket edition of Shakespeare, and a blue steel French helmet that became his trademark. He thought they were superior to the English tin helmet. When his command was merged with another, Churchill resigned and returned to Parliament. He fought hard to restore his reputation and was helped along by a government investigation that shifted some of the blame for Gallipoli to the Prime Minister and other high officials. Shortly after, he was made Minister of Munitions and set out to convince the English that airplanes and tanks were essential for their victory. He also helped convince America to enter the war, a move which accelerated the end of the conflict. That end occurred in November 1918, while jubilant Londoners took to the streets to embrace, dance, and wave their Union Jacks. Churchill's comment at the time was, "I was conscious of reaction rather than elation." At the end of World War II, Churchill was a balding, chubby man of 44 who almost always had a cigar in his mouth and was known for both his arrogance and his charm. Now that peace had returned, he was appointed Minister of War, with the task of bringing all the soldiers home and easing their re-entry into society. Once that was done, he dedicated himself to establishing the now famous Royal Air Force, and he also sent troops to Russia to try and crush the Communist Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, a man Churchill called a plague bacillus. This move was unpopular from the start and ended in complete failure. By 1921, when he was 47 years old, Churchill grew tired of being in charge of a military that had no wars to fight, and so he accepted a post as Secretary of State of the Colonies, which put him in charge of all the colonies of the British Empire. The years in this post were difficult ones professionally and personally. He angered both Jews and Arabs with his negotiations in the Middle East. He alienated the Irish by increasing British power in their country. His mother died after complications following a broken leg. His youngest child, Marigold, became ill and died within a week, and he himself had an emergency appendectomy. On the bright side, he had another child after Marigold died, named Mary, and he had a successful show of his paintings in Paris. But politically, he was on his way out again. In 1921, Churchill lost the favor of the British public when he threatened war with Turkey. In an election the following year, he lost his seat in Parliament and retreated to his new country home in Kent called Chartwell. For the next few years, he consoled himself with his painting, writing, "In the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seal, without a party, and without an appendix." Then in 1924, when he was 50, he ran for and won a new seat in Parliament as an independent affiliated with the Conservative Party. He was promptly offered the job of Chancellor of the Exchequer, a position his father once held that was second only to the Prime Minister's. The Exchequer was responsible for the finances of the nation, a responsibility that for Churchill came at a difficult economic time in Britain's history. Industrial strikes and unemployment were common, and a worldwide depression was beginning. Yet Winston Churchill was a man who as a student hated math more than any other subject and, as an adult, could never even manage his own personal budget. His work as Exchequer was unsuccessful, and he lost popularity when he tried to repress a general strike involving thousands of workers. By 1929, the English voted the Conservative Party out of power, and Churchill once again retreated to Chartwell to paint, write, read, and study radio broadcasting. It would be 10 years before he returned to public office again. During his decade out of office, Churchill still managed to let his opinions be known, largely through his writing and public speaking. He strongly opposed self-rule for India, a view that was so unpopular that by the time he was 60, it seemed his political career would never be revived. He raised the ire of his countrymen again in 1936, when King Edward VIII decided to abdicate the throne and marry a twice-divorced American named Wallis Simpson. At the time, Churchill suggested that perhaps it was the puritanical government that should abdicate rather than the king. Churchill was also doing a lot of traveling in these days, and one of the countries he visited was Germany. He came home very disturbed by what he saw, which he described as bands of sturdy Teutonic youths marching through the streets and roads of Germany with the light of desire in their eyes to suffer for their fatherland. Soon as Hitler's power rose, he began to think war between Germany and Britain was inevitable. No one believed him. The English too well recalled the horrors of World War I and refused to heed his warnings. In speech after speech, Churchill denounced the war spirit rising in Germany and what he called its pitiless ill treatment of minorities. He urged more money for arms, for training, and for military research. Still, England chose to believe that an armed conflict could be avoided. Even as Germany occupied the Rhineland and then annexed Austria, the British government averted its eyes. Finally, in 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler in Munich, gave in to his demands that Germany take over large sections of Czechoslovakia, and arrived home announcing he'd signed a treaty of peace with Hitler. Churchill called it instead a total defeat, and he added, "This is only the first step, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year, unless, by a supreme recovery of our moral health and martial vigor, we arise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time." The following year he was proved right when Germany claimed the rest of Czechoslovakia. Suddenly the government saw what Churchill had known all along. Now Britain guaranteed aid to Poland, Greece, and Romania in case of Nazi attack. Air raid drills became common throughout England, and the first peacetime draft in the history of the country was started. Then the dreaded and unthinkable happened. Germany invaded Poland, an ally of Britain. 2 days later, Britain declared war. Prime Minister Chamberlain immediately offered Churchill his old post from World War I, Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill accepted, and the joyful message was radioed out to the fleet, "Winston is back." The first few months of the war were quiet, with only occasional skirmishes. But in 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, and then Holland and Belgium. British attempts to intervene ended in failure. Chamberlain, humiliated by the defeats, resigned his office. There was only one person he could turn to take his place. The man who, for many months now, had been giving radio broadcasts in which his lispy voice called for unity, courage, and determination. The man was Churchill. Churchill said on the day that he finally took the highest office in his land, "It is as if I were walking with destiny, and that all of my past life has been a preparation for this hour and for this trial." Then he rallied the House of Commons with his famous speech, in which he said he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He told them, "You ask what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. What is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival." It was the first of many stirring speeches that Churchill gave throughout the war that kept the people of Britain hopeful and inspired. As an orator, he was unsurpassed. Churchill was 65 years old when he took on the duties of Prime Minister, but he worked with astounding vigor and strength. He worked through most nights until dawn and then slept late, sometimes awaking early and working in bed until 11 in the morning. Then he went to his office and stayed until 5, when he had a whiskey and soda, took a quick nap, had dinner and a short game of backgammon with his wife, then returned to work. He saw his country through the retreat at Dunkirk, when British soldiers had to be rescued from the shores of France by hundreds of civilian boat owners. He saw them through the Battle of Britain, when day after day heavily outnumbered British pilots flew against huge German formations, prompting his famous comment that never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. He saw them through the Blitz, when for 57 consecutive nights a constant rain of German bombs sent Londoners scurrying into the underground for safety. The British refused to be terrorized because their Prime Minister refused to be. He could be seen everywhere, raising his fingers in the victory sign, visiting bombed-out towns and meeting with the homeless, sometimes weeping with them. He worked hard on his radio speeches, staying up late at night to compose them so they'd have just the right combination of honesty and optimism. Through his personal example and through his defiant speeches, the British people began to more than just hope for victory. They began to believe in it. By 1941, Britain was no longer fighting alone. Russia had joined the war after Germany unsuccessfully invaded it, and then America joined in after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Churchill worked hard at coordinating the efforts of the Allies, and it was largely through his efforts that the trio worked in unison and with goodwill towards each other. By 1945, Germany was overcome by the military might of the Allies and surrendered. The fighting had claimed 40 million lives. Churchill resigned as Prime Minister, so a new government could be elected. But he had every intention of being the victor in that election. After the war, Churchill met with Russian leader Joseph Stalin and the new American president Harry Truman at Potsdam, where they shaped the boundaries and political makeup of the world that is largely what we know today. That same month, he lost his campaign for prime minister, mostly because he spent his time attacking his opponents, who spent their time promising the British strong economic and social reforms to help them recover from the war. In 1946, he traveled to America to speak at Westminster College, where he gave one of the most memorable and explosive speeches of his career about the rising tyranny of the Soviet Union. It was the speech in which he invented the phrase, Iron Curtain. It was a curtain he said had descended across Europe, leaving communist influence and power on one side and democracy on the other. Once again, he shocked people, many of whom still saw Russia as an ally, and once again, he had been the first to see what nobody else wanted to see. In 1951, Churchill launched a successful campaign to be re-elected as prime minister. In his second term, he concentrated mostly on foreign affairs. But this term took its toll on Churchill. He was by now 80 years old, and the work was an immense physical strain. He suffered a mild stroke in 1953, which he kept secret from the public, and told his doctor, "I feel like an aeroplane at the end of its flight, in the dusk, with the petrol running out, in search of a safe landing." In 1955, he finally retired. Churchill lived 10 more years after he retired. He spent his time painting and writing, collected many honors and awards, and occasionally gave a speech to Parliament. As he approached 90, his faculties began to desert him. He gave up reading and writing, seldom spoke, and failed to recognize his visitors. In January of 1965, he suffered another stroke and surprised his doctors by refusing his brandy and cigars for the first time. He died on January 24th, the anniversary of his own father's death at the age of 90. Churchill's body lay in state at Westminster Hall, where thousands of people filed by to pay their respects. There was a state funeral at St. Paul's, where, at his request, the Battle Hymn of the Republic was played. Then his body was taken down the River Thames by boat to a train that carried it to the family churchyard, where he was buried next to his father. Winston Churchill was one of those rare individuals who, like Abraham Lincoln, seemed to have been born for one critical moment in history. Both felt a supreme sense of destiny to their lives, a specific purpose that transcended but conformed with their own will. They both fought hard to position themselves so they would be ready when that divine role revealed itself. And in both cases, it was the cause of uniting their countries and leading them through a long and brutal war. A war that could easily have given rise to despair and defeatism. What Churchill brought to England at its time of need were the qualities and values of an older England that was by then fading. He was, in a sense, an anachronism in his own country, one of the last of the Victorians, a 19th century man living in the 20th century. He had the soul of a soldier and loved heroic deeds and brave fighting men. He was proud of England and its heritage. He believed in its possessions and its supremacy. He himself said, "I was a child of the Victorian era when the structure of our country seemed firmly set, when its position in trade and on the seas was unrivaled, when the realization of the greatness of our empire and of our duty to preserve it was ever growing stronger." This extreme patriotism and sense of supremacy was passing even as Churchill still lived, but it had one final part to play in the drama that was World War II. These beliefs, and Churchill himself, who personified them, were exactly what England needed to unite and fight the desperate battles of World War II. For many people, Winston Churchill was England.
This is the end of the session.